Hello, I'm back, and here we're going to look at Chapter 7, just Chapter 7. So Chapter 7 deals with Hermes, and Hestia, again, deals primarily with Hermes. Now, one of the things that opens the chapter, which I think is sort of important, is a guy named Walter Otto wrote a short book, I think it's maybe 150 pages, 200 pages at most, called The Homeric Gods. And in it, he argues that each of the Homeric gods, each of the Olympian gods mainly, have a singularity, have a thing that they're known for. And I read the book, and he doesn't go into like that for every single god, which I think is unfortunate. But he does talk about Hermes, and he says for Hermes, his singularity, the thing that sets him apart from the other gods, is joy. He is a god who brings joy, who represents joy. Now, Maurizio brings up a different author, a guy named Jean-Paul Vernant, and he argues that Hermes has a singularity, but that singularity is movement. And he does a good job of saying in a lot of art that shows all of the gods, the god that Hermes is generally standing near is Hestia. Hestia is almost always shown as seated. She's the goddess of the hearth, and she represents home and a place where you stay, and Hermes indicates movement. He's the god of the roads. I think I lean more towards Vernant in this, but Hermes definitely is also a joyous god, unlike some of the other gods who often can be pretty difficult. The literature piece is another Homeric hymn number 4 to Hermes. The basic plot is that baby Hermes, he is a baby, he's like a day or two old, baby Hermes lies and steals his way into Mount Olympus. So it starts, he's born in a cave, his mom is sort of happy and staying in the cave because that means she's out of the public eye, and that means that Hera's not going to come looking for her, gunning for her, because she has been boinking Hera's man, which gets Hera upset. But Hermes is like, yeah, no, we're destined for great things. We're not going to stay here. And that seems to represent something that was going on in society when this hymn was composed. It's thought that it was composed sometime in the 7th century, so the 600s, a time when the Greeks were doing a lot of colonization. They were doing a lot of they were sailing and trading with other people around the Mediterranean. They had been doing some of that before, but in Homeric society, that was all viewed as guest friendship. So in other words, you go somewhere and they give you gifts, and then someone comes to you and you give them gifts, and that's a way of sort of keeping the economy moving through a series of gifts. But what happens when you move to a mercantile economy is that then you use cash, however that's envisioned, as a means of determining how business negotiations go, right? So you purchase something and then you sell it. And you ideally make a profit when you sell it. And therefore that's how you build your wealth, by buying cheap and selling dear. So at any rate, Hermes is sort of a god who represents business interests, and some people think that Homeric hymn number 4 was composed at a time when the business class, when the mercantile class was growing, and they needed to move away from the old way of looking things, which would have been to look at traders as basically pirates, moving them to honored citizens, which is sort of what they would be during the classical period. So that happens in the early archaic period, and maybe even a little before the early archaic period. The likelihood is that the hymn was written at that time. The scholarship in Chapter 2 deals with archetypes. So we had structuralism, which was a way of looking at myths. Another way of looking at stories or myths is to look at them in terms of archetypes. So archetypes are sort of central type characters that you see in stories. So you might have the wise old man. So if you look like Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi, right, is the wise old man who provides help and guidance to Luke, who's the rookie, the young guy, sort of, trying to make his way. Those are archetypes, right? the young rookie, the seasoned veteran. You could also have figures like the trickster figure is an archetype. As are the shadow is an archetype. The Incredible Hulk would be like a shadow character to Bruce Banner, for instance. So all of those archetypes are a way of looking at stories, the characters, because what happens is when they tell stories, they try to create these characters, these different types. When you look at this, pay attention especially to William Doty and William Hines. They list 5 characteristics that they find in most trickster stories. And you can look at Homeric Hymn number 4 and see, do they all apply to Hermes in this? Do they apply to Hermes in general, but then also do they apply to Hermes in this particular work? I think in general you will say yes, all 5 will apply to Hermes. Some of them probably you don't see in Homeric Hymn number 4. The comparison section deals with the Egyptian god Thoth. And Thoth and Hermes are primarily linked. I mean, the ancient Greeks felt that Thoth was the Egyptian name for Hermes, that they were the same god seen by 2 different peoples with different names, but it's the same basic god. But the big thing where they share a thing is literacy. In Greek myth, sometimes Prometheus is the literacy god. He's the one who teaches humans how to write, how to learn an alphabet and then write. But in some versions, it's Hermes who does that. And it makes some sense that it be Hermes, because Hermes is a god of business, right? And business, of course, really requires writing things down, right? Keeping a ledger and that sort of thing. So, there is some reason for sort of attributing that to Hermes. Well, in the Egyptian system, that was Thoth. And of course, the Egyptian writing system goes back way before the Greeks had any writing system. Even linear A is late, and linear B are later than the Egyptian writing system. So, it's a big deal. Now, there's a nice passage from Plato's Phaedrus where Socrates basically says that Thoth, he gives him a different, he calls him Thuth or something. The Greek pronunciation of it was different. But that Thoth did no favors for the Egyptians by teaching them how to write. That actually saps memory, right? If you don't have something you can go back to and look at, then your memory has to really be sharp. But on the other hand, then you're depending on your memory, and if your memory fails, you don't have something to go back to. So, the final thing here is Hermes Trismegistus. What happened in Egypt as the Romans started to get involved in Egypt was the figure of Hermes and the figure of Thoth were then sort of merged together into a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. And this figure is generally shown as an old man with a long beard, which is very different than Hermes in art, right? And Hermes in art does not have a beard generally in Greek art. And then Thoth generally has an ibis head, right? A bird head. So neither of them look like this guy. But my recollection is that there was someone named Hermes Trismegistus who was sort of a magus, who was like a magician, and that he, claimed actually to be sort of the incarnation. And there were writings attributed to him called the Hermetic writings that we have. Those are quite late, actually. They're well after the time that the guy who was Hermes Trismegistus lived. But it's just sort of an interesting thing. And if you look in art, sometimes you'll see Hermes with a big long white beard, and it's like, wait a minute, how is that guy Hermes? Well, it's because of this Hermes Trismegistus figure that he looks that way. Now, the reception part, the Nachleben part here, is, I think, very bizarre. But it looks at the figure of Hermaphroditus in pre-Raphaelite art. So the pre-Raphaelites were 19th century, early 20th century British artists and poets. And the hermaphrodite, of course, is a figure that has both male and female sexual organs and doesn't quite fit. Now, in the myth, Hermaphroditus is the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, hence his name, Hermaphroditus, and that he is a nymph named Salmachus. She's a nymph of a warm spring, so like a hot water spring, and he walks into her water, and then she basically won't let him go, and so they merge and become one. Right? That's the story, and but it makes some sense that Hermaphroditus, this figure of both genders, who's neither one nor the other, but is actually sort of both, is associated with Hermes, because Hermes is a guy who sort of doesn't follow boundaries, right? He doesn't color between the lines. He's the guy between here and there, not either here or there, but sort of in the middle. So it makes some sense that figure would be. But I just find it very strange that in very proper Victorian England, right? Because we're talking a bit up till the 1901, right? We're in the Victorian period. Queen Victoria Britain is very proper, right? I mean, think like Downton Abbey, but Downton Abbey like even further back, right? It's all very proper, and here you've got, gender bending, which is, like for us is not, not unheard of. There are a lot of people who identify as non-binary. That would not have been common in the 19th century. So it's interesting that this figure becomes such a fascination for that period. All right, that's going to end it for chapter 7. See you next time for chapter 8.